Francis, if I've done my research correctly, you first arrived in Vietnam in February 1966, is that right?
That's right, yes.
How old were you?
26.
26. The first time abroad as a reporter?
As a reporter, yes. Of course, I had been otherwise.
What was your background before you went out there?
Well, I was at Radcliffe, and I studied Middle Eastern history. And I had started doing some journalism in New York. I wrote for the Sunday magazine of the Herald Tribune for a couple of years.
When you arrived in Vietnam, how did you fit in with the press corps when you got there?
Well, I wasn't sure. I was such a naive and such a young reporter. I really didn't know what I was doing. At first at all, never having been to Asia or to a war, and I certainly was looking to others to give me some sense of direction, and they did. I think that journalists, certainly abroad, make wonderful colleagues, and they were very helpful to me.
Yeah, one of the worst crimes is not to help your colleague
That's right.
in the foreign
That's right.
Profession. I know that from personal experience. But were you accredited when you went over there, or were you a freelance? How do you describe yourself?
I was accredited as a freelancer. Yeah.
Accredited as a freelancer.
That's right.
Well, the environment of the freelance work is something that maybe a lot of people don't understand. Something which, as I know from experience too, it takes the long view. You have to figure out how well you did at the end of the year in the way of getting printed or getting published or broadcast, the case may be. Did you find that being freelance gave you any different status in the eyes of the military or in the eyes of your associates?
Certainly in the eyes of the military. They weren't pleased to see me at all most of the time. I remember one particularly difficult time I had while I was doing a piece for the New York Times Sunday magazine. And the military at this particular provincial capital where I was had me checked back right through New York. They were just very uncertain that I was who I said I was, and so on.
They wanted a confirmation in New York that you were in reality writing for the New York Times.
That's right.
Time. And if you had not been, what would have happened? No cooperation?
Well, no cooperation.
How did you finance yourself as a freelance? Paying the bills is not easy for a freelancer sometimes.
No, that's true, but I guess I was lucky at the time I went there, because when in 1966, it was just as the troops had gone in, every magazine in the country practically was looking for a story on Vietnam, and there were very few at that point magazine journalists out there. So, and the daily newspaper, television journalists and so on couldn't take the time to do magazine pieces. So essentially anything that I could do would be printed.
Did they come to you, or did you offer it to them?
Well, I mostly offered it to them, but after a while they began to come to me.
Well, when you got there and you met the local press corps, what did you find was their primary interest?
Well, most of them were new. There was sort of a new batch of people who came in as a result of the American troops going in there. So there were very few of them that knew much about the past. Their main concern, their focus, was to follow the American war.
In other words, they were doing day-to-day progress of the war, combat reporting.
Yes.
That didn't interest you?
I figured they knew how to do that. What started to interest me almost immediately was the Vietnamese. What was going on in Saigon politics? What was this thing called pacification? What were all the American programs that were designed to fight the so-called political war?
So you were interested primarily in the, let us say, the history of Vietnam and the politics of Vietnam.
Well, finally, and as a consequence of this, because I began to see that it was not just myself that really didn't understand the Vietnamese politics, but it was the mission officials, there were other reporters there, and I began to see again we were launched on this enormous war without knowing very much about the country we were in.
Did you have the impression, perhaps, that the American military, the American intelligence, had not done its homework, had not read its history, had not studied, well, just from 1954, Dien Bien Phu, on up to the present?
Well, they certainly hadn't learned the lessons of the French War. On the other hand, it really wasn't because they were stupid or badly prepared or that kind of thing. It was that they didn't want to learn those lessons. If they had, they would have just had to withdraw.
You mean they blinded themselves to it on purpose?
I think that there is far more self-deception than deception involved.
Well, you became acquainted with the French experience, I'm sure, in your own research out there.
Mm-hmm.
What was the turning point? Where did you discover this information? In any particular place?
Well, I was lucky enough to be given a book by Professor Paul Mus, who had written an extraordinary volume on the history of the French War. It's called Sociologie d'une guerre. And I read it when I was there. Mus had grown up in Vietnam, and he'd come back and was an archaeologist and an ethnologist. He had talked to Ho Chi Minh. He'd been one of those people who thought that it was possible to make a reconciliation between the French and Ho Chi Minh, that he was against the French colonial war. And where I found this book particularly valuable was in his understanding of the Vietnamese and his understanding of their revolution. And it changed my whole attitude about the war.
Did you have the feeling that we were going to make the same mistakes that the French had made after reading that?
Well, it seemed to me that it would be, in some way, because quantitatively different in simply magnitude and force, that it might be qualitatively different. At the same time, the more I learned about the Vietnamese, and a lot of this was done after I came back, after that year in Vietnam, the more I understood that nothing had changed for them, that we were the equivalent of the French, and that we were simply carrying on a useless and probably doomed war, as the French had.
To return to your remark about the military not being interested in the history, it puzzles me a little bit. Were they simply blinding themselves to it? They just did not want to be curious about it, or did they suspect there was bad news there?
Well, I think on one hand, many people did suspect that there was bad news there. And a lot of others, too, felt that there was simply no parallel, that American military might was so great that there was no lessons we could learn from anybody before. After all, we'd come out victorious from the Second World War, from Korea. We'd really never had a defeat in our whole history. And when you saw the contrast between an installation like Cam Bay, or if you watch the bombers, you couldn't imagine that any such a small country with relatively few weapons could stand up against it.
Do you feel that this lack of historical grasp on the part of the military and part of the United States is continuing today? Now, in this era, when we look back upon the war, what attitudes do we hold in the United States, if any, about Vietnam? Or what are we communicating to the generations coming up about what happened in Vietnam?
Well, it seems to me that, first of all, I'd rather put the emphasis on the political leadership in this country. I think that, the military, in that case, did pretty much what it was told to do. And it could not make any independent investigation. It felt that was, in some way, unconstitutional. It had been told to go and fight a war, and it did it. Okay. It seems to me that it is with the political direction that we have to hold responsible. It seems to me that certainly with the Reagan administration, that nothing has changed very much. I mean, we hear much the same things about Central America as we did about Vietnam. And right now, our effort in El Salvador looks very much like our effort in Vietnam in the early 60s. We have a government that we've supported that is obviously failing, so what do? More military aid, some more American advisors. Again, this notion that a few American advisors, a few covert operations can somehow stop the social upheavals of Latin America.
You've been back to Vietnam. You went in and out of there several times, did you not?
Yes, I did.
When were you last there?
I was last there in 1974-75. I was in Hanoi.
In Hanoi.
Yeah.
What did you find there at that time? Anything that was surprising to you? Anything different than what your preconception might have been?
Immediately, there was something different. I had, from all the time I'd spent in the South, conceived somehow that the Northerners were different, that they were somehow in a powerful state, that they were much more developed somehow, that they were rigid, uniform, sort of army of ants, if you want. Not a bit. They're just like the Southerners. So, and perhaps the country was less developed than the South, although there had been some industry in the North. But if you went into the villages, you'd see peasants still moving the water from one dike to the next by these wooden wheels, which are, you ride like a bicycle. That wouldn't have happened in the South by the end of the war. So I was once again astonished by the inequality between the American effort and the looks of what the Vietnamese were doing.
These were the sort of people that looked as though they would be easily vanquished by the might of the United States.
Well, you know, you arrive at the airport in Hanoi and it was a field. And it took 2 hours to get into the city because all the bridges had been bombed and the traffic was bicycle traffic. There were very few cars around to be used. Now, obviously, the military had plenty of motors, plenty of tanks, and so on by that time. But you couldn't believe that a society that operated with wooden water wheels and bicycles could somehow mount such an effort.
There was great talk of the adversary relationship that existed between the press and the military during the Vietnamese War. Were you aware of that, and did it affect you?
Well, in 1966, it really wasn't the case. I think that the military were, at that point, rather grateful to see reporters. They always considered them, as it were, on their side. This had been the history, certainly in the Second World War and in Korea. It was after 1968, after the Tet Offensive, that this hostility began to grow. And the military, when I went back to South Vietnam in 1971, and again in 1973, were looking at the press as the adversary. Indeed, I remember very well, we reporters captured a document from JUSPOW, the Joint Information Services, and it was a memorandum drawn up by one of the officers, information officers, and it was called Obstacles to Mission Fulfillment. And it had a list, and the list began with the North Vietnamese Army. It went on to the Viet Cong. It then listed the press and U.S. public opinion.
The press has been described by some of your colleagues as the arbiters of the truth, the arbiter of the truth, if you will, during that period to which you refer. Would you agree? Well,
I think that journalists individually and collectively as well did their best to get as close to the truth as possible. Of course, the press was far from uniform. There were many different perspectives, different opinions, different ways of approaching the same subject. I don't suppose that they considered themselves arbiters. but rather as people who were seeking to find something that was true, and they felt that that was difficult.
With the benefit of hindsight, what's your opinion of the quality of the work that was done by the press in Vietnam?
Well, some of it was exceptionally good, extraordinarily good, and against enormous odds. Again, it'd be hard to say this was true for the press corps as a whole, because as you remember, there were, at the height of the war, there were some 500 reporters there, and you know, the quality was uneven.
The work that you've done is not confined to Vietnam. I have read that you were in Iran in '74, right?
Yes, that's right.
And you won the Overseas Press Club Award for magazine reporting that year from Iran. It was before the fall of the Shah, right?
Yes, I'm happy to say that I predicted the fall of the Shah in '74. That is to say, I didn't give it a hard and fixed date, but I said that his regime was far less stable than most Americans in any way suspected. And the piece became rather famous because it was the only one that said that at that time. I mean, it really wasn't until the revolution actually broke out that the American press began to take a hard look at the nature of the Shah's regime.
Well, when you got in there, again, there were representatives with the world press in Tehran when you arrived. How were they working? How were they functioning when you went in? What was your evaluation of it? Apparently, you came in and you saw a weakening in the base of the power structure of the Shah, but apparently they did not see it. Am I wrong?
No, that's true, but I'm surprised that they didn't, because I did not interview any of the Ayatollahs. I did not interview people on the street, where I was interviewing high officials of the Shah's regime, just as other reporters did, and I found that even they didn't like the Shah, so I considered that it must be far weaker than one supposed. I tell you what, the American press was not paying much attention. I think they were sort of dazzled by the image of this supposedly traditional monarch. He wasn't. I mean, his father was a military leader who'd overturned the last dynasty and elevated himself with some fancy Persian name. There were not many American press there permanently in Iran at the time. They came later. The French press on the whole did very well, much better than the American, particularly Le Monde.
I remember when I was running bureaus overseas, and I'd be on a job for, let's say, 8 months in an area, perhaps a year, and there'd be a new reporter, a new correspondent come into the city, and the old-timers would say, what is he or she writing about? Because the typewriter was burning day or night. Day and night, I should say. There was a fresh point of view, apparently. Do you think that accounted for the fact that you saw things a little differently? You had a fresh viewpoint?
Well, I think that as far as the American press went, that it was more lack of attention than anything else. And I remember not only was reading the French press helpful to me, but meeting one British correspondent for The Economist there, who was very, very good. And I learned a lot from him. As from kind of underground press in this country, and people who are looking at Iran from a different perspective, from a perspective that was, if you will, informed by Vietnam, that is, of the dangers of American military alliances with dictatorships, and questioning what this very authoritarian regime was really doing for its people. So again, I wasn't totally alone or without help in this, but it came from sources that most of the American press wasn't looking at.
Did you feel in Iran that our intelligence operation was something less than what it should have been?
It seemed to me that way, and indeed it proved that way in the end. I think what happens is that when our intelligence, or indeed anyone else's, starts trying to save the regime from its own internal enemies, it becomes helpless itself. It becomes used by the regime rather than vice versa. Our intelligence certainly had no clue of the enormous strength of the revolutionary movement. They didn't know very much about any of the mullahs. They really didn't even see the weakness of the political weakness of the Shah's regime.
And apparently you were alone in that observation.
What had happened, in hindsight, is that our intelligence had simply wrapped itself around the Shah, so to the extent that it really couldn't see anything else. It couldn't talk to the opposition because the Shah's intelligence agents would have stopped that. It was so engaged in trying to preserve the Shah from its own internal enemies that in a sense it became an agent of the Shah, an agent of Savak rather than vice versa.
Savak being the intelligence agency for the Shah.
Yeah.
Would you say that our intelligence agency then was being used or permitting themselves to be used by the Shah?
Well, they were permitting themselves to be stymied completely. They're permitting themselves to be blindfolded, as it were, because they simply would know no more than the local Savak agents, and perhaps a bit less because they weren't necessarily told everything.
We, in my conversations with many of our colleagues, there have been hints that the CIA in Vietnam and in other places in the world has made an effort to use the CIA's phrase, target in on certain correspondence, to use them. Did that ever touch you in any way?
No, it didn't. Too well known. My father was a high official in the CIA, and there is no nepotism in the CIA, so that's one reason for it. But certainly it's something that he never would have even imagined. I think he was very nervous about my going there as a very young woman anyway. So I probably would have been the last person.
I was referring to some of the statements by former CIA personnel that they fed, to use their word, disinformation to certain correspondents in Vietnam. You didn't feel that anyone ever tried to do that to you, huh?
Well, you know, anyone who simply swallowed and printed what any U.S. official said to them seems to me foolish. I mean, you know, that it's not some peculiar, strange plot on the part of CIA or anyone else. I mean, officials were saying all kinds of things which weren't true. And if you couldn't sort that out, well, you know, caveat emptor.
The free press in our democracy today, would you say that it guarantees that its existence, as we know it now, would make it difficult to sell another war like Vietnam to the American people?
Well, I think it would make it more difficult. I think that the press has learned something from Vietnam. Its coverage of El Salvador is proof of that, I think. They're much quicker to the mark than they were before. I don't think that because of that, it's therefore renders the U.S. incapable of going to war at any time or in any place. But I do think that it has put certain kinds of considerations in the public debate that weren't there before. Is this really, are these guerrillas really an army trained by Moscow, or are there local considerations? That kind of perspective on events.
Do you feel that in some future conflict, we may have a repetition of what existed in the recent Falklands affair, where there was a complete control of the press by both sides?
Well, it of course was easier to do there because so isolated, physically impossible for the press to get there except on British ships. However, I do think that it's a very dangerous sign that a democracy like Britain's could put this kind of censorship on a war where clearly national security was not at stake. I mean, it seems to me that there's perhaps some reason to worry if the life of a nation is actually threatened, but to close down press freedoms in the way that they did over what was, essentially a small incident seems to me very dangerous.
You've been studying the manner in which the textbooks in American schools, if I understand this correctly, are treating recent American history. Mm-hmm. What have been your conclusions?
Well, they were very odd about the war for a long time, and the problem for textbook publishers is that they have to find some kind of line which will be acceptable to everybody, and since the war split the country down the middle, they were quite incapable of describing it.
You're speaking the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam
Mm-hmm.
War, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
They had for a long time what I like to call the Crabgrass Theory of the war. That is to say that the war just started one day and it kept growing and growing. And it grew and it grew, and in spite of all American attempts to stop it, it kept growing, and finally it stopped.
And is that treatment going to change in the future, do you think, or will it continue?
It depends on American public opinion, and in a way the textbooks are a very good index as to what people think about that war, or indeed everything else. That's why I use them really as a sort of litmus test.
Francis, in my work as a foreign correspondent, I worked with a number of distinguished and highly capable women reporters. Maggie Higgins and Charlie Cowwood and I covered Marshal Pétain's trial in Paris after World War II. It was one of her first assignments. And I was with Anne Stringer of United Press in World War II, Dixie Tai, and many others. And I often admired them very, very much, and I thought they worked under very difficult circumstances. I didn't feel that they were discriminated against because they were women, but I thought life was a little difficult for them at times because they were women in the field. Was it any different in Vietnam for you? Did you feel that being a woman made it more difficult?
Well, it certainly was more difficult vis-a-vis the U.S. military, and one expected that. I think that as far as the State Department, civilian officials went much easier. As far as the Vietnamese went, it may have actually been an advantage to be a woman, because you weren't as threatening as any American man would have been.
What about Iran? Was it difficult being a woman in Iran?
Well, again, it helped and it didn't. Iran is a terribly sort of male chauvinist culture, as you know. And so I found that the Shah's officials, for example, didn't expect very much out of me, right? They didn't expect that I really would ever take a sort of hostile attitude towards them, that I could be in any way aggressive, or that I even knew very much about economics, politics, and the like. And thus, while they, perhaps would not go into as great detail on analytical matters as they might have with a man, they'd often say things that came straight from the heart, I think, much more, expecting that I wouldn't hear it in some way.
Because you were a woman?
Because I was a woman.
I have read, one of your colleagues observed that many of the men of other countries, because they hated America and they hated American men, felt that it was sort of an opportunity for them, an unusual opportunity to talk to the woman who represented the nation they hated, that somehow or other they could speak more straightly, more honestly to her than they could to the men of that nation. Did you see what I'm getting at here?
I don't know if it's that exactly. I wouldn't say it was a question of, I don't know, representing one's country as a woman. I don't think that it's quite that. I think that it's simply that as a woman, one can often sort of get in underneath certain kinds of defenses, certain kinds of perhaps hostilities. Also, one can talk to the women of other countries easier. And that's a source that male reporters usually don't have. And so there are certain advantages.
Ultima pregunta here. That's, what do you see as the big stories of the future? Where will you, as a foreign correspondent, as one who's interested in the international picture, where will you be concentrating your attention in the next 10 years?
Well, there may be two different questions, in fact, because if you ask what the story will be, it's hard to predict, but of course the Middle East is going to go on. And I am interested in doing some more Middle Eastern reporting myself, having started there. South Africa is going to be very important. The whole continent, in fact. There's a lot to be done. Whether I'll do it myself, I don't know. Similarly, Latin America is usually undercovered by the press. Central America is momentarily an exception to that. Then, of course, there's the whole communist world. There are generations of reporters which pass through Moscow. It's very hard to keep going back as a reporter just because you're not allowed to. Similarly in China. It may be that the new generation of reporters has a completely different perspective as the last two have in China. It's really interesting to watch that develop.
Well, there's a belief that in some quarters that what we're viewing in Eastern Europe today, Poland as an example, is the exhaustion of communism, that communism, the system is tired and breaking down. Do you see that as a possible story? Do you see it as a possibility that could come to pass?
Of course it is. Of course it is. But the question is, will it come to pass with Soviet tanks on the borders? That's, it's very hard to know where solidarity can possibly go from here. I find it very interesting that not only in the Third World, but Poland as well, that the real revolutionary movements are rejecting what we had always assumed was modern. Communism on one hand, and anti-communism, the free world on the other. And they're, from Khomeini to the Solidarity movement, they're going back to their own roots. They're going back to religious roots often, often cultural roots that have nothing to do with either the United States or the Soviet Union.
Well, as we talk, there are conferences scheduled between Moscow and Beijing on the borders of China and Russia that they think may lead to a reduction of the tremendous troop concentrations that are stationed there. There are other borders in the world that present problems. We have a border in the United States that presents a very real problem vis-a-vis Mexico. Mm-hmm. There's, you might say, borders all around the world that deserve our attention. What do you see? Well,
indeed. I don't know. I think that in some way the world is a much more traditional place than we thought it was going to be after World War II. There was some sense in which we thought that history had come to an end. Having defeated fascism, facing the totally new power of nuclear weapons, facing the ideology of communism as a worldwide revolutionary ideology, we thought that history would be quite different than it was before World War II. And I think that we're finding that this is not the case. That, in fact, most of the changes that have taken place in the world order have taken place without reference to either nuclear weapons or to communism and anti-communism. Very interesting. That indeed we're back to a world of border wars, civil conflicts, limited engagements, wars over territory, wars over the traditional matters of wars.
Do you feel that the time for surrogate wars is past? We'll see no more of them.
In a sense, where was there a real surrogate war? We thought that Vietnam was a surrogate for China. It turned out not to be the case at all. I think we had built up Vietnam as this enormous symbol of the contest between the free world and the communist world. It didn't turn out to be that at all. It turned out to be Vietnamese Revolution expression of nationalism, which took a communist form, but it certainly was not a test of the two great power blocs. So it seems to me, again, even that conflict, except for the way we looked at it, it was far more traditional than we supposed.